In the summer of 1698, 5 ships left the port of Leith, carrying roughly 1,200 people and the accumulated savings of a nation. They were sailing for a stretch of swamp and jungle on the Caribbean coast of what is now Panama. The plan was to build a trading post there, a warehouse on the narrowest part of the Americas, where goods could cross from the Atlantic to the Pacific on mules instead of sailing around the bottom of South America. The man who conceived it called that place the door of the seas and the key of the universe. Within 2 years, roughly 2,000 of the people who went were dead. The colony was abandoned twice, besieged once, and surrendered. Almost none of the money came back. And within 7 years, Scotland had ceased to exist as an independent state. Those two facts are connected, and the connection is the reason this story matters. This is not simply a tale of a failed colony. There were dozens of those. It is the story of the only occasion in European history when a single commercial venture bankrupted a country so comprehensively that the country stopped being a country. This video is about how that happened, what Scotland was trying to solve, why Panama looked like the answer, what the money actually was, what went wrong in the swamp, and how a failed investment turned into a constitutional settlement that has lasted more than 300 years. And we will be careful about the part that is genuinely disputed, because a great deal of what people confidently say about Darien is more certain than the evidence allows. Start with the problem, because Darien was an answer to a question, and the question was desperate. Scotland in the 1690s was poor. Not poor by the standards of a bad decade. Poor structurally in ways that had no obvious remedy. It had roughly 1 million people. It had limited good agricultural land, a small domestic market, and almost no colonial possessions. Its principal exports were raw or barely processed: wool, linen, coal, salt, fish, cattle driven south into England. And it sat next to the most successful commercial empire then being assembled in Europe without being allowed inside it. That last point is the one that matters most, and it is worth being precise about the mechanism, because it explains the whole scheme. England had passed a series of laws, the Navigation Acts, reserving trade with English colonies to English ships, English crews, and English merchants. The intention was to keep the profits of empire inside the country that had built it, and by the standards of the age, it was ordinary policy. The Dutch did the same. Everybody did. But Scotland, since 1603, had shared a monarch with England while remaining a separate kingdom with its own parliament, laws, currency, and, crucially, its own commercial status. Which meant that under the Navigation Acts, Scots were foreigners. Consider what that meant in practice. A merchant in Glasgow, subject to the same king as a merchant in Bristol, could not legally trade with Virginia or Barbados or Jamaica. The single most profitable commercial system in the Atlantic world was operating on his doorstep, and he was outside it by law. There was smuggling, of course. There always is. But smuggling is not a national economic strategy. So Scotland had a shared crown, no share of the empire, and no realistic prospect of taking colonies by force from anyone who already held them. Then the weather made everything worse. Between roughly 1695 and 1699, Scotland suffered a run of catastrophic harvests. The period is remembered as the 7 ill years, and it produced genuine famine, not hardship, famine. being careful with numbers here, because this is one of the places where confident figures outrun the evidence. Parish records are incomplete, and estimates of the death toll vary substantially. What is not disputed is that some regions lost a very large share of their population to starvation and disease, that grain had to be imported at ruinous cost, and that people emigrated in numbers that alarmed the government. Set those two things side by side. A country structurally locked out of the most profitable trade in the world, and simultaneously in the middle of a famine. That is the context in which a proposal to stake an enormous sum on a colony in Central America stopped sounding reckless and started sounding like the only idea anyone had. Now the man. William Paterson was born in Dumfriesshire around 1658, the son of a farmer. He spent his early adulthood abroad, in the West Indies and in Amsterdam and Hamburg, trading and learning the mechanics of credit and joint stock finance in the places where those techniques were most advanced. And he was not a crank. This is the single most important thing to understand about him, and it is usually left out. In 1694, Paterson was one of the founders of the Bank of England. That institution, the one that still exists, that anchors the British financial system, was created by a group of promoters who proposed lending the English government £1.25 million in exchange for the right to issue notes against the debt. Paterson was among them. He sat as a director. So the author of the Darien scheme was a man who had already co-founded what became the most durable financial institution in the world. He fell out with his fellow directors and left within a year over disputes about the bank's management. But the point stands. When he came to Edinburgh with a plan, he arrived as a man with a track record, not as a dreamer with a map. And his idea was genuinely clever. That also gets lost. Look at a map of the Americas. To get goods from Europe to the Pacific, to Peru, to the Philippines, to China, a ship had to sail all the way south and round Cape Horn, one of the most dangerous passages on Earth, adding months to a voyage and losing vessels routinely. Unless it did not have to. At the Isthmus of Panama, the two oceans are separated by roughly 50 miles of land. Goods landed on the Caribbean side could be carried across and reloaded on the Pacific side. Spain already did exactly this with its silver from Peru, hauling it overland to the Caribbean coast for shipment to Seville. Paterson's proposal was to establish a free port on that isthmus, open to all nations, charging fees for warehousing and transit. Not a plantation colony producing sugar or tobacco, but an entrepot, a toll booth on the narrowest part of the world. Understand the logic, and you understand why serious people gave him money. It required no army, no conquest, no plantation economy. It required a harbor, a warehouse, and a road. 300 years later, the Panama Canal was built about 150 miles from where he wanted to put it, for substantially the same reason. The geography was not the mistake. In June 1695, the Scottish Parliament passed an act establishing the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies, with a monopoly on Scottish trade with those regions for 31 years, plus exemption from customs duties. And here the story takes the turn that made everything afterwards a national matter rather than a commercial one. The original plan was for the capital to come from both Scotland and England. There was English interest, substantial English interest, from merchants who could see the same logic Paterson could, and who resented the East India Company's monopoly. The East India Company noticed. So did the English Parliament. The House of Commons investigated, threatened English subscribers with impeachment, and made it unmistakably clear that English money in a Scottish trading company would be treated as an attack on English commercial interests. The English capital withdrew. That left a company with a monopoly, a plan, and no money in the poorest country in Western Europe in the middle of a famine. So the company did something that had never been done on that scale in Scotland and has rarely been done anywhere since. It went to the public. The subscription opened in Edinburgh in February 1696, and it became a national event. The books were signed by nobles and by merchants, but also by ministers, lawyers, small landowners, shopkeepers, widows, and burgh councils, subscribing corporately on behalf of their towns. Glasgow subscribed. Edinburgh subscribed. Ordinary people put in sums that represented years of income. The nominal total raised was $400,000 sterling. Now, the claim you will hear repeated everywhere is that this represented somewhere between a quarter and a half of all the money in Scotland. And this is exactly the sort of figure that deserves scrutiny rather than repetition. The honest position is this: nobody in 1696 was measuring national wealth because the concept and the statistics did not exist. Every figure you see is a modern reconstruction from fragmentary evidence, and the reconstructions disagree with each other. What can be said with confidence is narrower and quite sufficient. The sum was enormous relative to the size of the Scottish economy. It was raised almost entirely from domestic sources in a country that had very little spare capital. It represented a very large share of the nation's available liquid wealth, the money not tied up in land, and it was concentrated in precisely the class of people who provided credit to everyone else. That last point is what made the failure systemic rather than merely sad. When the money went, it did not only impoverish the subscribers, it removed a large part of the credit available to the entire Scottish economy at once. So, a national subscription, a monopoly company, a plan that made geographic sense, and a country with nothing else to try. In July 1698, 5 ships sailed from Leith: the St. Andrew, the Caledonia, the Unicorn, and 2 smaller vessels, the Dolphin and the Endeavour. They carried around 1,200 people, and they carried the cargo the company had assembled to trade with the inhabitants of Central America. That cargo has become the most quoted detail of the whole story, and it deserves its reputation. Among the goods loaded were woolen stockings, heavy blankets, wigs, combs, clay pipes, Bibles, substantial quantities of periwigs. These were being taken to a tropical rainforest, roughly 9 degrees north of the equator, to trade with people who had no use for any of it. It is easy to laugh, and people have laughed for 3 centuries. But it is worth asking why it happened, because the answer is more interesting than mere stupidity. The company was assembled by men who had never seen the tropics, buying goods from Scottish suppliers in a country with no colonial trading experience to draw on, and no reliable information about what the inhabitants of Darien actually wanted. They loaded what Scotland made. It is a failure of information, not of intelligence, and the same failure in less comic forms runs through the entire venture. They also, and more seriously, did not carry enough food. The fleet reached the coast of Darien in early November 1698, and the first sight of it seemed to justify everything. There was a large, sheltered, deep, natural harbour. The land was green and obviously fertile. There was fresh water. The local Guna people were initially welcoming. They had their own reasons, being hostile to Spanish authority and interested in allies. The settlers named the territory New Caledonia. They laid out a settlement called New Edinburgh and began a fort, Fort St. Andrew, at the harbour mouth. Before going further, it is worth stopping on the people who actually lived there, because they are usually reduced to scenery in this story, and they were nothing of the kind. The inhabitants of that coast were the Guna, sometimes written Kuna or Kuna. They had occupied the region long before any European arrived, and by 1698 they had been resisting Spanish authority for the better part of 2 centuries. That resistance is the whole reason the Scots were welcomed. The Guna were not naive hosts charmed by visitors. They were a people with a specific strategic interest. Any European power hostile to Spain was a potential ally, and the Scots arrived visibly hostile to Spain and visibly weak, which made them useful rather than threatening. So, there was a genuine, if limited, alliance. Guna leaders met the Scots, traded with them, guided them, and in at least one instance fought alongside them against Spanish forces. Some of the settlers' survival through that first winter was due to food supplied by people the company had brought nothing worth trading for. It is also worth noting what the Guna did afterwards, because it puts the whole European episode in proportion. They went on resisting. They resisted Spain, then Colombia, and in 1925 they mounted a revolution against the Panamanian state that won them autonomy over that same stretch of coast. The territory is governed today as Guna Yala by the Guna. So, the standard framing, a doomed European colony in an empty jungle, has it backwards. The Scots were the temporary presence. The people who were there before them are still there, still governing it, 300 years after New Edinburgh rotted into the ground. And then the place began to kill them. The harbour that looked so sheltered was surrounded by swamp. The rainy season arrived. And the diseases of the region, malaria and yellow fever carried by mosquitoes, alongside dysentery from contaminated water, moved through 1,200 Europeans with no acquired immunity and no understanding of transmission. Nobody in 1698 knew that mosquitoes carried disease. That connection would not be established for 200 years. The settlers believed illness came from bad air and from the miasma of rotting vegetation, which meant that every rational precaution they took was aimed at the wrong thing. The death rate became appalling. At the worst point, contemporary accounts describe roughly 10 burials a day out of a population already reduced by earlier losses. A tenth of the settlers were dead within a few months. The fort was not finished. The ground was too wet for the crops they had brought seed for. The trade goods were unsellable. And the food they had brought was running out, some of it spoiled before it was opened. The other thing that failed was the government of the place, and it failed by design. The company had not appointed a single commander. Authority was vested in a council, with the ship's captains and the company's appointed councillors all holding a share of it, and no clear provision for what happened when they disagreed. They disagreed almost immediately. The naval officers and the landsmen took different views of nearly everything, where the fort should go, whether to fortify or to plant, whether to send ships out trading or keep them in the harbour, who had the authority to order whom. Patterson himself, whose scheme it was, held no formal command at all. He was aboard as a private person and could advise but not decide. Two of the names that recur in the surviving accounts are Robert Pennyquick, who commanded the St. Andrew and behaved as though naval seniority settled the matter, and Thomas Drummond, a soldier who wanted the fort finished and the settlement defended. Their disputes are recorded at length, in the tone of men who despise each other and have nowhere to go. Meanwhile, the councillors were dying. Illness removed decision-makers faster than the council could replace them, so authority kept shifting to whoever was still standing, which is not a system. This matters more than it sounds. A colony in that position needs to make a small number of decisions very quickly and correctly. Move off the swamp, ration hard, get a ship out for supplies immediately, finish the defenses. Instead, every one of those decisions was argued about for weeks by men with equal standing and opposite instincts. It is a mundane failure, and mundane failures are what actually kill colonies. Disease set the clock. The absence of anyone who could simply give an order meant the clock ran out. Then came the decision that turned a struggling colony into a doomed one, and it was made 3,000 miles away. Scotland and England shared a king, William III. William was, above all else, engaged in a long strategic contest with France, and in that contest, Spain's position mattered enormously. Spain claimed Darien. Spain regarded the Scottish settlement as an armed incursion into its territory and said so forcefully. William had no intention of provoking a war with Spain over a Scottish trading company he had never wanted. So instructions went out to the English colonies in the Caribbean and North America, Jamaica, Barbados, New York, forbidding them from providing any assistance to the Scots at Darien. Read what that meant on the ground. A colony of starving, feverish Scots sat within reach of English ports, holding food and medicine under the same crown, and were refused. It is worth being precise about the reasoning, because it is often described as simple English malice, and it was something colder than that. It was a calculation in which the survival of 1,200 Scots was worth less than not antagonizing Madrid. Whether that calculation was defensible is a question people still argue about. That it was made is not in doubt. By the summer of 1699, the survivors had had enough. In July, they abandoned the settlement after 8 months and sailed north. The voyage home killed many of those the swamp had not. Of roughly 1,200 who had sailed from Leith, only a few hundred ever saw Scotland again. And now the part of the story that is almost unbearable to relate. While the survivors were abandoning New Caledonia, a second expedition was sailing towards it. Communication across the Atlantic took months. The company in Edinburgh had heard little, and what it had heard was fragmentary and largely optimistic. The early letters had been written before the dying began in earnest. So it did what a company in that position does. It reinforced its investment. Around 1,000 more people sailed in the autumn of 1699. They arrived in November to find New Edinburgh empty. Huts collapsing, graves, a fort half-built and abandoned. They tried to hold it anyway. It went as the first attempt had gone: disease, hunger, and a leadership that fell to arguing among itself. It is worth understanding why Spain cared so much about a stretch of coast it had never successfully settled, because from Madrid, this was not a minor irritation. The Isthmus of Panama was the single most important piece of ground in the Spanish Empire. Silver from the mines of Peru, the revenue that funded Spanish armies and Spanish debt across Europe, came north by sea to Panama City on the Pacific coast, then overland across the isthmus, then to the Caribbean ports for the convoy to Seville. That crossing was the artery. Everything depended on it. Spain also knew exactly how vulnerable it was, because it had been attacked there repeatedly. Francis Drake had raided the mule trains in the 1570s. Henry Morgan had crossed the isthmus and sacked Panama City in 1671. The region was not an empty frontier. It was a place Spain had learned to be frightened about. So a fortified foreign settlement on the Caribbean side, positioned precisely to control transit, was not read as a trading post. It was read as a knife held against the empire's central nerve, placed there by a Protestant power in alliance with the Guna, who had been raiding Spanish interests for generations. Spain had also tried and failed to hold that exact coast itself. The terrain that killed the Scots had defeated Spanish attempts at settlement too. Madrid's conclusion was not that the place was worthless, but that nobody should have it. Which explains the scale of the response. Spain did not send a punitive raid. It assembled a proper expedition, troops from Cartagena and Portobello, warships to blockade, to remove the settlement permanently. And that assembly took time, which is the grim irony of the second expedition's timing. The 1,000 Scots who arrived in November 1699 sailed into a colony already abandoned, and then into the path of a force that had been months in preparation for the colony that no longer existed. Then Spain, which had spent the interval assembling a response, moved. Spanish forces besieged Fort St. Andrew by land and blockaded it by sea. At the end of March 1700, the Scots surrendered. The Spanish commander, in a detail that says something about the state the defenders were in, granted honourable terms and allowed them to leave with their ships and colours. The dead, across both expeditions, numbered somewhere around 2,000. A handful of ships returned. The money was gone. Now to Scotland, and what the failure actually did. The immediate effect was the destruction of a very large part of Scottish private capital, concentrated among the people who lent money to everyone else. Understand how that propagates. A landowner who put £1,000 into the company had not merely lost £1,000. He had lost the security he borrowed against, the credit he extended to tenants, the dowries he had promised, and his ability to fund anything at all. Multiply that across most of the propertied class of a small country simultaneously, and you do not have a bad investment. You have a credit system that has stopped functioning. There was also a political effect, and it cut in an unexpected direction. The obvious reaction to Darien was fury at England for the navigation acts that had made a Scottish colonial venture necessary, for the parliamentary pressure that drove out English capital, and for the orders forbidding the colonies to help. That fury was real and it was loud. But alongside it ran a colder argument, and it was this argument that eventually won. If Scotland could not trade inside the English Empire, and could not build an empire of its own, and had just proved the second point at the cost of 2,000 lives and most of its money, Then what exactly was the plan? Before we get to the Union itself, there is an episode between the two that shows how poisonous the atmosphere had become, and it very nearly wrecked everything. In 1704, an English ship called the Worcester, belonging to the East India Company, put in at Leith. 2 years earlier, a Company of Scotland vessel, the Speedy Return, had sailed for the east and never come back. Nobody in Scotland knew what had happened to her. In an atmosphere already boiling over Darien, a rumour took hold that the Worcester's crew had seized her and murdered the men aboard. The evidence was thin to the point of transparency. It rested largely on overheard remarks and on statements from crewmen who changed their accounts. There was no wreck, no bodies, and no direct testimony from anyone who had witnessed anything. The captain of the Worcester, Thomas Green, and 2 of his crew were tried for piracy in Edinburgh, convicted and sentenced to death. What followed was not a legal process so much as a public mood. Queen Anne's government pressed for clemency. The Scottish Privy Council wavered. Crowds gathered in Edinburgh demanding the sentence be carried out, and the pressure was intense enough that the councillors who might have granted a reprieve did not attend the meeting where it would have been decided. Green and 2 others were hanged on Leith sands in April 1705. It later emerged that the Speedy Return had almost certainly been taken by an entirely different set of pirates in the Indian Ocean, with no connection to the Worcester at all. 3 men were executed for a crime that had probably not been committed by them, and possibly had not happened as described. That is the temperature of Anglo-Scottish relations in the 2 years before the Union, an English captain hanged by an Edinburgh crowd's insistence on evidence that would not survive an afternoon's scrutiny over the disappearance of a ship belonging to the Darien Company. And it is exactly what makes the Union so strange. 2 years after that, the same Parliament, representing the same public, voted to dissolve itself into a state with England. The fury and the settlement were not in sequence. They were simultaneous. Union had been discussed for a century without ever becoming attractive enough to accomplish. Darien changed the arithmetic. The Treaty of Union was negotiated in 1706 and took effect on the 1st of May 1707. Scotland's Parliament voted itself out of existence. The 2 kingdoms became one, and Scottish merchants received what they had wanted throughout: full legal access to English colonial trade. The negotiation was not a clean transaction between equals. There was patronage, there were pensions, there were peerages, and there were men who voted for union having been made comfortable for doing so. Historians have argued for 3 centuries about how much of the outcome that bought, and this video is not going to pretend the question is settled. But there is one clause that connects the whole story, and it is worth reading closely. Article 15 of the treaty provided for a payment from England to Scotland of 398,085 and 10 shillings. It was called the equivalent. Officially, it compensated Scotland for assuming a share of England's national debt and for adjustments to customs and excise. And part of it did exactly that. But a substantial portion of the equivalent was directed to a specific purpose, repaying the shareholders of the Company of Scotland with interest and winding the company up. So the sequence, stated plainly, is this: Scotland raised an enormous sum for a colonial venture. The venture failed catastrophically, partly through its own errors and partly through the deliberate refusal of help from a shared crown. The resulting ruin made independence look economically unsustainable. And the settlement that ended independence contained, written into its text, a payment that made the ruined investors whole. Whether you regard that as a rescue or as a purchase depends on your politics, and people have taken both views vehemently for 300 years. What is not in dispute is the mechanism. The money that compensated Darien's losers arrived as part of the price of union. There is a small institutional afterlife worth mentioning because it shows how these things persist. The body set up to administer the equivalent payments continued to exist after its immediate job was done. It evolved over decades into a banking company, and that company became the Royal Bank of Scotland. So, an institution created to clear up the wreckage of Darien is a direct ancestor of one of the largest banks in the world, which itself required an enormous state rescue in 2008. There is no neat moral in that. It is simply what happened. And William Patterson? He survived. He had gone with the first expedition, lost his wife there, and came home broken by fever. He spent years arguing for compensation and for his reputation, and in 1715, the British Parliament granted him a substantial sum in recognition of his losses. He had also, throughout, kept arguing for union on the grounds that access to English trade was the only route left. The man whose scheme had impoverished Scotland spent his final years advocating the settlement that resulted, and he did not appear to see a contradiction in it. So what should we take from this, beyond the story itself? The first thing is that the idea was not stupid. That is the conclusion people reach, and it is wrong. A transit route across the Isthmus of Panama was such a good idea that it was eventually built at enormous expense, and it remains one of the most strategically important pieces of infrastructure on the planet. What failed was not the concept. It was everything required to execute it. Information about the destination, medical understanding that did not exist for another 2 centuries, supplies, leadership, and the diplomatic protection that a state can provide and a company cannot. The second thing is more uncomfortable, and it is about concentration. Scotland did not fail because it made a bad investment. Countries make bad investments constantly. Scotland failed because it made one bad investment with a very large share of everything it had at a moment when it had no reserves to absorb the loss. A diversified nation loses a colony and is embarrassed. A nation that has put a quarter of its liquid capital into one swamp loses the colony and loses its independence. That is a lesson about position, not about judgment, and the comparison that proves it is close at hand. 20 years after Darien, England produced the South Sea Bubble. The South Sea Company proposed to take on a large part of the British national debt in exchange for a monopoly on trade with Spanish South America. Trade it had almost no practical means of conducting in territories Spain had no intention of opening. By any measure of underlying substance, it was a far weaker proposition than a transit route across the isthmus. It was, in large part, a debt conversion scheme wearing a commercial costume. It collapsed in 1720. Fortunes were destroyed. Members of Parliament were ruined and some were disgraced. Isaac Newton lost a great deal of money. The political fallout reshaped British government. And Britain carried on. Nobody suggests the South Sea Bubble cost England its independence, because the idea is absurd. The country was large enough and its capital diversified enough that a catastrophic speculative failure was a catastrophe inside a functioning economy rather than the end of one. Darien was a better idea that killed a country. The South Sea Bubble was a worse idea that embarrassed one. The difference is not the quality of the reasoning. It is entirely a question of how much of the whole was staked on a single outcome. And the third thing is the one that took me by surprise in the sources. For all the retrospective certainty, the people involved were not gambling in ignorance of the odds. They knew colonial ventures failed frequently. They knew the tropics killed Europeans. They knew Spain claimed the territory. They went anyway because the alternative on offer was a country with no route to prosperity at all, in the middle of a famine, watching its people emigrate. That is not recklessness. It is what a decision looks like when every option is bad and one of them at least has an upside. 2,000 people died at the door of the seas. 7 years later, the parliament that had authorized the venture voted itself out of existence, and the money came back from London, written into the treaty that dissolved it. Sources and method. This account draws on the surviving records of the Company of Scotland, contemporaneous correspondence and journals from both Darien expeditions, the text of the Treaty of Union and, in particular, Article 15, and the substantial modern historical literature on the scheme and on Scottish economic conditions in the 1690s. Where figures are contested, the death tolls, and above all the share of Scottish national wealth invested, this video sets out what can be said with confidence rather than repeating a single number as settled. National wealth was not measured in 1696. Every such figure is a modern reconstruction, and the reconstructions disagree. Where motive is disputed, most notably the weight to give patronage in securing the Union vote, it says that the argument exists rather than resolving it.